I just wanted to tell you how happy I am that you're all here, that this event is happening, that tomorrow is going to be happening. And I really want to, for us to take a minute to thank the committee co-chairs, the committee members. This is Kara Mitchell that you just met, Courtney Sharp, Azura Cox, Blair Story Johnson, Dana McKinney, Francisco Lara Garcia, Catherine Curiel, Megan Eccles, and Shani Carter for making this possible. I also want to take this opportunity to thank a few members of the old ASU, other friends of the school. Sekou Cook, who's here. We had the pleasure of seeing him in Chicago recently. Sarah Zwady, Hector Torres Picard, Ethan Lassiter, Eric Shaw, who's, I think, the 4th GSD graduate director of planning in DC, Omar Davis, and many others who are here this afternoon. I think what is so wonderful and exciting about this event is that not only the topic that it's dealing with, but also many of the people that it's bringing together. And I'm so honored and so pleased that if you look at our brochure, that such a large proportion of these people who will be speaking to us today and tomorrow are actually connected with the GSD. We have, of course, among us David Lee, who has taught here for many years in the past, Stephen Gray, who has just joined us at the GSD as a new assistant professor of urban design, Liz Ogbu, a graduate of the school, Timon and Turan Evans, Michael Pride is a graduate of the school, Sarah I already mentioned, Nat Belcher, who is now the chair and professor at Penn State, William Williams, and many, many, many other people. And as I said, other speakers, Setu, Brent Leggs, Phil Freelon, and so the list goes on. So I'm mentioning those names specifically because I think it's really important to recognize the enormous contribution that people have made. I see Tony Griffin here in front of me. So many people who've really made significant impact towards the built environment, towards the kinds of issues that will be discussed. And I think that for me is also a celebration of their contribution, of their commitment, of the fantastic work that they have done. It's a kind of interesting moment for me personally because I just remembered that it was exactly 20 years ago that I helped organize a conference in this room called Denaturalized Urbanity, Race, Gender, and Ethnicity in the Landscape of the American City. And the purpose of that conference exactly 20 years ago, 1994, 1995, was to examine the relationship between race and space, questions of gender, the role of ethnicity. So, for example, we dealt with the way in which a synagogue was turned into a Korean temple, and the relationship between the iconology of the synagogue and its erasure in order to become a Korean temple, that this is like a spatial project that deals with questions of ethnicity. We had a fantastic presentation about race and space that was actually about the movie, The Lion King, and the connection of The Lion King to the degradation, if you like, of the American city, and how the movie industry was really using entertainment to reinforce certain ideological constructs, and what was the connection between the movie industry and its kind of affirmations and the landscape of the American city. And, yesterday we had a group of our visiting committee go to see the work that some of the students are doing with Professor Dan DeOka upstairs on the Martin Luther King boulevards, which is something that he will also touch on. My point is that on one level, nothing has changed, that there's 20 years since then, and the issues remain really absolutely pertinent, and that the relationship between race and space, the way in which one could say that the racialization of space is becoming even more extreme, is continuing. And so I think it's fantastic that this group of students and alumni have come together with the support of so many other people, so many of you from other institutions, to really help us think through these really critical questions today, but at the same time to really open up new possibilities to help celebrate all the work that you're doing. I think the organizers reminded me that it's important that this is not only something that is focusing on the difficulties, but it's also important to recognize the positive aspect and really the celebration and the commitment of all the great energy that you have and all the fantastic work that you do. I think in the school, it is true that over the last let's say 7 or 8 years, we've tried to have, with the support of a large group of students, faculty, and staff, a systematic kind of re-examination of the way that we operate as an institution, how we can really be a more diverse institution, and how the question of diversity is a fundamental issue, fundamental aspect of our creative endeavor. In other words, we do not see diversity as a kind of problem-solving thing. We see diversity as an opportunity, which really is critical in terms of how we think about our cities, how we think about the way in which, in our field, we think about scenario planning of the kind of sets of relationships, sets of connections that can happen. And I think that that's a really significant part of what we are about. I think we've had some success. We obviously need to do a lot more, especially, I think, from the perspective of the students when it comes to the way in which our curriculum is being tuned to respond to some of these issues that are so pertinent and so critical today. And I think we will be really focusing on that. So we're really optimistic about today and tomorrow, and hope and know that we will learn a great deal from all of you. And we're really excited and grateful to all the organizers for making this possible. And I for one, am looking forward to an incredible day and a half or whatever is left of this event. So thank you again for very, very much for being here, and let's sort of really celebrate and move forward with this really important project. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Michael Hayes, the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, and I'm really honored to have been invited to moderate the panel for tonight. But you're probably wondering why all these white guys are introducing black in design. So I'll try to explain. And of course, I'm going to, of course, quote Dr. Martin Luther King, and I'm not going to edit the racial and gendered language that he uses at the 1960s. To find the origins of the Negro problem, we must turn to the white man's problem. Now, I think what Dr. King may have meant by the white man's problem is what I want to call the white spatial imaginary. And this is the problem. In the white spatial imaginary, whites are not represented to themselves as white. We are variously, we can be from different classes, we are gendered, we might be differently abled and differently sexualized. We might even recognize racial minorities, but in the white imaginary, white is not a race. So this spatial imaginary has it has certain consequences that are central to design. It's prevented some of us from understanding fundamental features of the social spaces in which we live. The white spatial imaginary has produced the neighborhoods, the workplaces, the schools, where white people, some know very little about black people, which in turn produces the kind of defensive localism that dominates decisions about public interventions and how services are distributed. And of course, it produces that privatism, which sometimes turns hostile. The radicalized place that black Americans live in have compelled them to develop a different optics. George Lipsitz from UC Santa Barbara stresses this and says that black people have had to, out of necessity, turn segregation into congregation. And this has produced a very different kind of spatial imaginary that counters this privatism and localism. So what I want to suggest, and remember that this first panel is about issues of pedagogy, and we were charged by the organizers to speak to how pedagogy can address issues of social injustice. And I want to suggest that this idea of a spatial imaginary helps us get to pedagogy. I want to borrow from the French philosopher Jacques Rancière, who talks about the distribution of the sensible. Now, sensible just refers to what can be apprehended by the senses. It's very, very central to design and even to art. The distribution of the sensible, it makes aesthetics central to politics. And this distribution is just a framework, the physical, spatial framework that ultimately produces that spatial imaginary, that determines, Rancière says, what is even possible to see or not see, what is possible to hear or not hear, what is even possible to say or even to think, to do, to make. Now, there's no political party involved here. There's no police force in Hummers. What's important is that which is possible to apprehend by the senses literally determines the condition of possibility for perception, thought, action. It determines the spatial imaginary. So what I want to submit, if we can think about teaching, if we can teach the techniques, the practices, the forms of design that distribute space, time, that distribute subjects and objects with this in mind, then we can have, pedagogically, can have very real effect on place-related opportunities. Thank you. I was done. I was going to go, but I have to introduce the panel. So I'm going to introduce the panel in the order that they will speak. It's also listed in the order that they will speak in your program. And I'm going to make very short introductions because the whole CV is, the bio is here. Amber Wiley will be our first speaker. She's assistant professor of American Studies at Skidmore College. Just having a piece in a book coming out is it out yet? Just about out, called Walking in Cities, Quotidian Mobility as Urban Theory, Method, and Practice. There are a number of other publications she's involved with about designing schools and about space, place, and pedagogy. That's also forthcoming. After Amber will be Dan Dioka. He's an urban planner, and as Mohsen said, he's teaching in Option Studio this semester at GSD. He's principal and co-founder of the New York-based architecture planning and research firm called Interborough and Partners, and he'll be talking about some of the work of Interborough. Diane Davis is our chair of the Department of Urban Planning and Design, and Charles Norton, professor of regional planning and urbanism at the GSD, and she's published widely. I won't list them here, but just to say that her current work often involves issues of violence and spatial defense in Mexico, but also, and I think you'll talk about the St. Louis project, the turn to American cities. And then also a professor of landscape architecture, associate professor of landscape architecture at GSD, Sonia Dumpelman, will follow Diane. Sonia has just had a publication of a book out called Flights of Imagination, Aviation, Landscape, and Design, and also has recently co-edited Women, Modernity, and Landscape Architecture. And then finally, Tony Griffin, who's also mentioned. Tony is right now professor of architecture and also the founding director of the Max Bond Center on design at City College in New York, is published widely, and is dedicated to teaching on issues of advancement of education, research, and advocacy in ways that make communities sustainable. So Amber, if you'll start us off. Thank you.
Okay, look at that. Fabulous. Hello, everybody. I'm Amber Wiley. I am from Skidmore. I just started that position, though. I previously was teaching at Tulane in the School of Architecture from 2011 till 2014, and then I just spent the last academic year traveling on the Society of Architectural Historians H. Allen Brooks Traveling Fellowship. I went to 6 countries, Mexico, Guatemala, Ghana, Ethiopia, India, and Vietnam, studying architectural history, looking at sites firsthand, really trying to figure out or get a firsthand experience of the non-Western tradition of architecture. But as I told some folks earlier today, every country that I went to had been colonized in any event. So then I was still looking at Spanish colonial as well, in addition to Mayan and Aztec architecture, or looking at British colonial and Dutch and Danish influences in Ghana. The Italians were in Ethiopia and did some things as well. The British in India, as well as the French in Vietnam. So it was trying to look at the indigenous histories of architecture, but also understanding the colonial aspects and how those are interpreted and reinterpreted in public history, as well as preservation projects. Now, my job at Skidmore, I'm in the American Studies department, and so I'm teaching 2 courses, one called The American City, and the other is called African American Experience. And I'm trying to take some of that architectural and spatial background and knowledge into informing how those classes get taught. Before I talk a bit about Skidmore, though, I would like to talk about the time that I spent at Tulane. And I was teaching required courses at Tulane, 2 of the required history courses for sophomores or second years. In this particular case, it was a 5-year program. And I tried to make the history class more engaging, a little bit more fun, thinking about architecture in any number of ways, very basic, simple ways. Architecture is nature. Architecture is afterlife. Architecture is ritual. Trying to move away from the dates and facts approach that many of our students felt that the history class, that's what it was about. I'm not even really good with dates myself, so I understand. Now, it was put upon me to teach the course in a way that I actually wasn't wholly prepared for, because I was told that I had to teach the global history of architecture. And even when I graduated from undergrad and got my master's, it was really about the Western history of architecture. And I said, okay, so I'm going to learn about Indian Buddhist shrines. I know nothing about India or nothing about Buddhism, but I can talk about it once I read about it. And so that's part of what that trip was, is to really gain an understanding of this non-Western tradition of architecture. But of course, as life would have it, I ended up in an American Studies program after that. So one of the reasons why we were really pushing for this global history of architecture is because of NAB. Now, I was only 3 years into my job at Tulane when I had to deal with NAB accreditation, and Maurice is in the audience. He was there with me. He understands. And we had, as faculty, to look at student performance criteria. What were these students learning? These are the things that the National Architecture Accrediting Board wants the students to learn, and they have to produce, or we have to produce, folders that show that they have the ability through student work to hit these key points that NAB wanted, or they had an understanding. And so we had to spend a lot of time thinking about these different realms of learning. Realm A, and this is 2009, they've updated it since 2013, 2014, critical thinking and representation. Integrated building practices, technical skills and knowledge. and leadership and practice. I think they renamed it to professional practice. So I had a steep learning curve in the first 3 years of teaching there and trying to understand what it is that the professional accrediting board wanted our students to know. What was critical to my courses, the history courses, the required courses I taught, I found that 2 realms in particular were useful to think about. This is not going to be a NAB workshop, so I'm going to skip a couple slides because y'all need to know all the details. If we go down to the bottom of this one, theoretical, social, political, economic, cultural, and environmental context, that means we expect our students to be able to work in a whole load of different contexts. And I was like, okay, this is good, because that's what, we do that in my class, cool. And that's what, I'm going to skip this one, histories of global tradition and culture, and move to another one, cultural diversity. This is one of the things that we had to say our students knew about. This is required by the Architecture Accreditation Board. Students should show an understanding of the diverse needs, values, and behavioral norms. This is very long. Social and spatial patterns that characterize cultures and individuals, and the implication of diversity on the societal roles and responsibilities of architects. They say it. They want us to do it. And I was like, yes, yes. So this right here is fodder. If you ever get the argument that, you know, it's not really important, that's not what we're about in design school. Oh, no, no, no. NAB says that's what we're about. We have to do this. Okay. Another one, and this has been renamed in Realm C, Leadership and Practice. They talk about managing, advocating, acting legally, ethically, and critically for the good of the client, society, and the public. This includes collaboration, business, and leadership skills. Again, if you ever get any pushback about what architecture is or what our role is as designers, or in my case, historian, say, no, no. Our accreditation board says that our students should be able to advocate and act legally and ethically and think critically about the impact of design on society. Yep, it's in there. I spent a lot of time with this material, so I know. And finally, I'm skipping those two. It brings us to the idea, you know, and I do know that we get pushback. So if you want to engage, say, the Black Lives Matter movement as designers, as historians, as urban planners, and people say, what does Black Lives Matter have to do with design or urban planning? You can just say, well, NAB accreditation says, and then go from there. So I was part of a project, Digital Humanities Project, the aggregate website, where a number of different historians, preservationists, planners, were asked to talk about the issue of Black Lives Matter. And it was a really powerful portfolio, and it was really heartening in a sense. This came out, I think, in the spring of this year, because people really wanted to talk about these things and give some sort of voice to the struggle. I'm going to talk a bit about 2 classes that I taught that had no effect whatsoever on our NAB accreditation, and that's 2 electives, upper level seminars that I taught. One was called Sights and Sounds Public History. In New Orleans, everything is touched by music. And so I wanted my students to be able to talk about historic narratives of New Orleans, the musical landscape, the parks, the pubs, the warehouses turned into clubs, all of these things, and give some sort of building history about it, and also to engage in the digital humanities. So what we were able to do is take a digital humanities program, platform that was being produced in the communications department at Tulane, and engage it with our own architectural history and building history work, and think about the way the music and the built environment overlapped in these ways. And so I'm going to skip that part. I had students who were able to meet students from other departments outside of the School of Architecture because they were engaged in this much larger project within Tulane. I'm so happy that I have this dewdrop in slide. So they use the platform to produce histories of particular sites throughout New Orleans that have the history of music embedded within them. Maurice Cox actually did a Tulane City Center project with the dewdrop in, but I had individual students doing research on it. And there was a stronger impetus for them to do the work right because it was public, and someone would have to read it. And that made them work harder and think harder about the things that they were doing. So there were social histories mixed in with the architectural histories, histories of space. I had graduate students who were my research assistants who helped me with my own research as it related to music and the urban landscape. And the research was actually picked up by City Lab just recently as people were looking at the anniversary of Katrina. Finally, we also had a public history program dedicated to some of the findings that the students made doing their research. We engaged the National Park Service in this conversation, and we actually had people who were involved with these various sites that we researched talking about what the site was before Katrina, how it changed after Katrina, and some of the struggles that they were dealing with now. 5 minutes. And so it was really wonderful because we were A, able to produce public history, B, I was able to engage graduate research assistants with it, and C, include the public in this larger discussion. And it was really kind of invigorating for me, and it was great for the students as well. We also had music. Finally, to talk about my second class, elective course, I stole this name from from Cornell. I was looking, when I was looking to do elective courses, I was trying to think of different topics I wanted to talk about. So I was looking at different schools of design and seeing what their classes were and if it made any sense to, so I took the Architecture, Culture, and Society. I don't know what that class at Cornell is about, but I know what my class is about. And so there's a lot of text here that I'm just going to skip through. But I want to talk about some of the underlying theory. I was able to give voice to some theory to talk about the relationship of architecture to culture and culture to society through my American Studies training. Michael came up here and he quoted a reverend/political activist. He quoted an American Studies scholar, and he quoted a philosopher. And so in this course here, we looked at philosophers' interpretations of the built environment, scholars who looked at capitalist society, and also the social production of space. And we used this theory to give my students a means of talking about the built environment in ways that they might not have talked about it before. Also, granted, a benefit of my American Studies background is that I was able to use film, music, poetry, novels, and art. I said, these people who produce these films, who produce this music, who produce this poetry, they're talking about the built environment too, and we should see them as people that are informing our understanding of the built environment. So fast forward, I did different themes. One theme was housing projects. We looked at Raymond Williams' definition of community, what it means to be a community. We read the scholarship of Arnold Hirsch in Making the Second Ghetto in Public Housing in Chicago. We talked about the Mecca Flats and its relationship to the construction of the IIT campus, but we also heard from Gwendolyn Brooks because she could tell us about everyday life in the Mecca Flats. We looked at the major figures in design, and we looked at the people whose voices hadn't been heard, people who were struggling not to have their homes demolished for the expansion of the IIT campus. You rarely hear their stories, but we heard about them in the class. We looked at the key legislation that informed the shapes of the housing, how legislation informs scale, how it informs distribution of housing throughout the city. And finally, we looked at reinterpretations, artistic reinterpretations. Kerry James Marshall, one of my favorite artists, and how he came to understand the spaces. So it wasn't just about the buildings themselves. We talked about the issues of what community is. We talked about how legislation affects these things. We talked about the theory behind capitalism and how it moves and shapes the way our built environment works, and also about how artists are informants in some of the results. So issues to talk about or think about, issues in the academy. The the public digital humanities project was great. It reached a lot of different areas, but there's unfortunately a devaluation and distrust of digital humanities. The print word still rules and books still reign supreme. So even though all that work was put into the elective course, it matters for naught if you're a young scholar, maybe on the tenure track, and you say, hey, I did this public history project, that's great, but is it in the article, is it the book? No. And so that's kind of discouraged. It's discouraging in a sense when you want to have these kinds of discussions and engagements with your students. And also, what I also realized is that for the elective courses, they weren't considered central to my students' understanding, and they didn't even contribute to NAB accreditation. They were fluff to the real work of the architectural education. But we can make the argument that these kinds of courses are necessary, and in fact the NAB requires them. And so whenever you're put up against a wall in that kind of way, say, no, NAB wants it. Finally, I just want to invite you, this is a plug, it's shameless. The Vernacular Architecture Forum on the board. We have a conference coming up in June in Durham, North Carolina, from farm to factory, Piedmont stories in black and white. Architectural historians talking about the racial landscape. Please come. We need more architects in our midst. Thank you.
All right. Let's see. Okay. Perfect. Thank you. Hi. So thanks for the invitation to speak at this amazing, awesome conference. I'm so thrilled that it's happening. I feel like we should give another round of applause to the organizers. This is just so exciting. The format's amazing. The round tables, it's great. And I want to say I'm also really happy I've been asked to talk about pedagogy, which coincidentally enough is one of my favorite things to talk about. My simple message is, let's give students more opportunities to address race, place, power, and privilege. Please, pretty please. In my experience, race generally is something that a lot of students have to be asked to ask questions about. But in my experience, when students are encouraged to explore what design can do to undo the effects of forced segregation, they knock it out of the park. So let's give them a chance. There's a lot at stake here. So I'm going to talk about a few projects that students of mine have done. Before I started teaching here at the GSD, I taught at the Maryland Institute College of Art in Baltimore, MICA. My students there were architects, sculptors, photographers. They were overwhelmingly white. MICA is in a neighborhood, Bolton Hill, which is white too. Interestingly, Bolton Hill is surrounded on all sides by neighborhoods that are overwhelmingly black. So you may have seen these judgmental maps. This is one of Baltimore. So there's MICA indicated by art nerds. So zooming in, we see it's surrounded by nothing but trouble, drugs and prostitutes, and The Wire. I didn't make this map. So here's a typical block in art nerds. Here's one in Nothing But Trouble. Here's one in The Wire. The first class I ever taught at MICA in 2005 was a survey class that looked at the policies, plans, and practices that have shaped cities in the United States. Since this class focused on race, I thought we should start by thinking about Bolton Hill. Why was it so white compared to the neighborhoods around it? Why was it so wealthy compared to the neighborhoods around it? Why were life expectancies so much higher? Actually, a 20-year life expectancy difference between this neighborhood and some of the surrounding ones. And why were the streets so relatively well maintained? These are pretty basic questions, and by now we have some pretty basic answers to them. We know that racial segregation was the product of dozens of local, state, federal policies aimed explicitly sometimes at creating two Americas, separate and unequal. We have racial zoning, we have redlining, we have highway construction, white man's roads through black man's homes, urban renewal, which James Baldwin famously called Negro removal, suburban incorporation, which formed a white suburban noose around our cities, racial covenants that defined who could and could not live in a house, racist code of ethics that brokers swore to uphold, and racial violence that confronted individuals who dared cross the color lines. So it was not difficult to tell a story about why these neighborhoods outside of the MICA bubble were so different. And this is what we talked about in class. Interestingly, though, I found that the students had to be taught to ask these questions about why these neighborhoods were so different. I think one reason had to do with the fact that this class was the first class they ever took in which they were asked to ask these questions about the causes and the consequences of segregation. I'd like to think that the uprisings in New York, Ferguson, and Baltimore have helped put segregation back on the agenda. Let's hope that this conference marks the beginning of a renewed interest in race here at the GSD, where it's clearly not talked about enough. In fact, just to take a step back, I think we don't generally talk about socio-political issues enough, period. I think many of us in the design field make the mistake of separating something off and marginalizing, I would argue, something called social design, as if not all design was social, as if our choices about what to build for whom and where, and in what style weren't political decisions. Of course they are. You can't be apolitical in this business. So let's embrace this fact. Let's train designers and planners to be politically literate, to scrutinize and question everything. When it comes to race, more specifically, it's important to remember that designers and planners from previous generations helped us get into the mess we're in. And we desperately need, I would argue, the best and brightest, that's you guys, to help us out of this mess. So the first project I want to talk about is this project called Baltimore Open City, and I'm just going to talk about it quickly because I didn't do it here. I want to focus on the projects I'm doing here. But in 2011, in my last year teaching at MICA, I worked with 28 students over the course of a year to mount a public exhibition about segregation called Baltimore Open City. Here's the cover of our book. Here's some spreads from the book we made. Interestingly, it actually started as a seminar, just a bunch of us sitting together reading books about race. But we wanted to do more, so to make a long story short, we found this cool old abandoned market space. We raised some money, we fixed it up, and we had an entirely student-produced, student-curated exhibition. These were undergrads. Here's our entryway where you see the clever logo that the students came up with. Adjacent to this is our curatorial statement, led with the statement, cities exist to bring people together, but cities can also keep people apart. And then went on to explain that Baltimore has historically been something of a pioneer in the keeping people apart business. So this is something we explored. You see also here our calendar. We had lots of events in the space, starting with our opening party, where we invited a local marching band to parade through the space. It was really loud. We also used a space to raise money for local progressive nonprofits. We had historians lead tours of historic sites of segregation in the city. The work itself was really varied. This was all student work, undergraduate work. So some students did a timeline of segregation in Baltimore. We had this map that introduced visitors to contemporary NIMBY battles being fought across the city. One student did these portraits of people who fought for integration in Baltimore. Again, student work, undergraduate student work. We also use the space to encourage people to be activists. So, for example, by helping us build this house out of We Buy Houses signs, these predatory signs. So we asked people to remove them from poles and sort of help us build this house. We asked people to come and help us get involved with local nonprofits who are combating segregation in the city. There's a strong public component. So one student made these amazing murals of planners on the infrastructure that they planned, along with some incriminating quotes about why they planned it. So here's an ad for the show. We pasted these posters around the city. Each one was site-specific. So this one was on Fulton Avenue, which represented the color line until it was busted by Blockbusters in the 60s. So we had about a half a dozen of these. Again, some spreads from our book. We invited local historians and activists to contribute to it. And I'm showing this project, it reflects my overall theme. So I mentioned earlier that, most of the students who took my classes had to be asked to ask questions about segregation. But what you see here is what students can do, even undergraduates, when given the chance to ask these questions. Okay, that's nice, but this is design school. We didn't come to the GSD to make exhibitions. We came here to get stuff done, GSD. I want to spend my remaining time showing a project that came out of a studio I taught in 2014. The studio was called The Storm, the Strife, and Everyday Life, See Changes in the Suburbs. And it invited students to work with nonprofit and community-based partners to update Long Island's built environment for today's demographic realities. So here we are on our field trip where we talked to people for whom Long Island was not working well. Long Island built primarily for wealthy, white, car-driving, nuclear families, but that's not increasingly the demographic profile of Long Island and a lot of other suburbs. So one person we talked to on the trip was Elaine Gross. She's the executive director of this great group called Erase Racism, Long Island-based group, and she made a pitch to the students. It was a tough one, but can you come up with ideas for building affordable housing in predominantly high-opportunity white communities that, because of NIMBYism, don't provide their fair share of affordable housing? Marcus Pulsifer, who is a Maud student, he took the bait, and he did a totally extraordinary project called the Schoolhouse Project. And its solution is to take vacant school properties that are located in these white high opportunity areas and convert them into mixed income suburban centers. So working with Elaine and also a civil rights attorney, he identified a school to serve as a prototype for this experiment. His proposed design of the school and the grounds was amazing, but the project didn't stop there. He spent a lot of time thinking about implementation and ended up creating 4 brochures and 4 presentations that made a case from left to right down below for the ethical importance, the legal necessity, the financial feasibility, and the attractiveness of this project. So each brochure was created from the perspective of a different actor and was aimed at a different audience. So the graphics are all really different. So let's take a look quickly. So the first presentation was from Erase Racism to HUD. So Marcus did some role-playing here, which isn't going to translate as I present this project. But this is a presentation to HUD to get them to support this idea. So it starts by looking at, so this is the brochure, starts by looking at segregation on Long Island, which you see is, it's a terrible problem. Here's a part where Marcus would say, is this the product of, preference? Of course not. All the studies done show that people want to generally live in mixed race communities. Here's where he would go into what caused segregation on Long Island. No time for that now. What are the consequences? So educational disparities would be one consequence. The blue numbers here are scores that are granted to schools on Long Island. The dots are African Americans. The background is income. And so what you see is that the schools with the most African Americans are the poorest. And these get the lowest test scores. They're given the least amount of money. They have the lowest amount of resources. On the right, you see an incredible contrast between 2 bordering towns, Garden City and Hempstead. So how are we going to break through this wall? We're going to use schools. There are a lot of schools. There are a lot of abandoned schools on Long Island. And they're great because they're connected to their neighborhoods. They're totally adaptable into all kinds of things. So now he's going to ask, what school? So he went through a number of indicators, which I'll take you through really fast. You want housing to be in a good school district. You want the housing to be in an area with a low crime rate. You want it close to transportation. You want it in a low poverty area. You want it to be safe from flooding, right? Low poverty, safe from flooding. So you overlay all of these, and to make a long story short, he landed on this shuttered school in Smithtown, Long Island. By the way, another factor here was where could this actually happen? So he was working with a civil rights attorney to determine this, and this is still an active case, which is really exciting. So here you see some of the good things about Smithtown. All right, so now we've made the case to HUD, put on another hat. So here Marcus has to make the pitch to investors. So we switched to a very different presentation, complete with clip art. I don't want to go into details except to say that he did a really good discounted cash flow analysis. He really worked with Long Island to identify funding opportunities. He ran the numbers and looked at the IRR, given a different funding opportunities. The next presentation was that to Smithtown, and this was HUD to Smithtown saying, you're in trouble. This is the stick, not the carrot, right? Comply or else. So he made this brochure and this presentation about how fair housing is a matter of law. So he did a review of fair housing policies. Point is, you can't try to keep people from moving into your town. He looked at Long Island projects, fair housing rules. The tide of exclusion is changing. He looked at recent cases that HUD has brought other wealthy white communities. HUD's getting serious about enforcing fair housing policies. He looked at the town itself, and he uncovered a history in this town of Smithtown of racial exclusion. He looked at how actually it has a lot less affordable housing than other suburbs just like it. The writing's on the wall. Let this happen, Smithtown, or else you're in trouble, and HUD's going to come after you. So the next presentation is from the developer to potential buyers, right? So here he's got a brochure. And of course, this doesn't look very GSD with the drop shadows and the argyle. But we worked very hard actually to identify a style that we thought the potential buyers into this development would like. So it started out very slick and GSD-like, and we sort of said, how about some argyle, some drop shots. Anyway, so I'm not going to go through it in detail. It was a really nice project, a very thoughtful project, and this is a glossy brochure, right? It shows the kind of site plan, it shows the amenity mix, the standard floor plans. Sells this in terms of this is near, dining, and it's near health clinics, and so on and so forth, and the unit price, and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of takeaways here. One of the reasons I think this project is so brilliant is because it positions the designer as someone who can bring things together. The urban designer isn't just a form maker. He is innovating in policy, politics, finance. I also appreciate that he made deliverables that were suitable to the project, in this case, brochures, presentations that he left with the client. I also appreciate the decision to, change the style of the project to suit the audience and make representations that are likely to resonate with that audience. And of course, this was his project. This is not my project. He scoped it. He decided to do it. Just to put my cards on the table, I think this is how we should be training our designers. This is the kind of interdisciplinary thinking that we need if we're going to start chipping away at structural racism. What was my role here? Introducing him to Elaine. Giving the students the opportunity to chip away at structural racism. The point being is that this is what we need to do. I think give our students the opportunity to do this. The more we let them do this, the better the solutions are. These are solutions that I never would have had. So I'm not going to talk about my studio this semester, but I'm giving my students the opportunity to do this again this semester. We're looking at streets named after Martin Luther King. King is super popular. There are 900 streets named after him, right? And a lot of them don't necessarily reflect the legacy of King. And so we're looking at how might you make streets that better reflect the legacy of King. So, you can see some of them across the country. We're looking at DC and St. Louis. Eric Shaw, who I think is here, is one of our clients at the Office of City Planning. Same deal. We're basically out with the students all the time, talking to people, trying to make connections, and giving the students the opportunities to come up with the solutions. They're better solutions than I could ever have. So let's give the students a chance, basically, is what I'm saying. Thanks.
Thanks. I don't have any slides. Okay. So, well, I stand before you with immense humility, thinking about all the awesome and important work that's just been presented and will be presented after me. So I'm going to be really short. I almost feel fraudulent being up here. I think I was asked to talk about the more official pedagogy as chair of the Department of Planning and Design. And I don't have slides, so I'm really fraudulent here in a planning and design school. The organizers asked me to talk a little bit about, actually they wanted me to talk about the ways that I incorporate issues of diversity, racial and spatial justice, and other related themes into my own work. And my own work and my own research. I'm going to try to do that, and I'll end with some comments about myself, but I did think it was important to start first by discussing these issues from the lens of the Urban Planning Design Department. So I'll be saying just a few words about pedagogy in theory, not in practice. Some of the rest of the presentations are pedagogy in practice. And I really hope what I'm saying is not going to be too unbelievably trite. It's something that we probably all know, but it's worth repeating because this conference just attests to the energy and enthusiasm and leadership of the students, many from planning and design, but also from architecture and landscape, that really is emerging up from the trenches of the school students here. And I think the least that we can do as the administrators of the department is to respond to their work in meaningful ways and try to do what we can to kind of move it to the next step. So what I wanted to say about what we're trying to do in urban planning and design is really recognize the fact that this is a multifaceted endeavor that involves integrating into the curriculum, whenever possible, questions of race, space, justice, exclusion. The list goes on and on. In theory, this may be happening more in the urban planning program than in the urban design program, although that is a statement in theory, and there are plenty of classes being offered in urban planning that are not stepping up to the plate in the ways that they should, and I'm sure that also in urban design there's more movement towards these questions. But I think that what we need a little more in our department and in the school as a whole is a more constructive and even can be combative dialogue across these programs about methodology, about concepts, and about assumptions, and whether the concepts, methods, and assumptions used in the disciplines and the different sub-disciplines are enabling or constraining attention to diversity. Sometimes I fear that we're too readily ghettoized into two camps. Those who have social concerns versus those with design concerns, or those focused on process versus those focused on product, or those with ethical priorities and those with aesthetic priorities, and other antinomies. And I think we just have to constantly be struggling to break down those polarizations, those dichotomizations, not just in conversations, but in every project that we do, every curriculum, that course that gets offered, we have to have that critical interrogation of those kind of dichotomies. I think that and as we've just seen from Dan's work, that some of this can be more easily accomplished by the framing of a subject or a topic that you throw different disciplines at. And that often happens in an option studio, maybe more readily than in the core curriculum. And this is something we have been talking about this weekend with the visiting committee. But I do think that the issue of thinking critically about what subjects can most draw the variety of spatial, racial, justice issues onto the table in a more organic way is what we need to be thinking. We shouldn't be thinking about the skills that need to be offered. Let's think about complex and controversial topics and subjects that those skills are used to disaggregate. Of course, ensuring diversity in the faculty and student body is absolutely central to all these, advances and aims, but that's all really obvious and not original, and everyone here knows this, so I'm not going to say anything else about that. So what I'd like to do now is just spend my last 3 minutes or something to answer the first question about myself and how I try to integrate these issues into my own scholarly and professional life. So I guess first and foremost, I would like to, and I hope this isn't too personal, but I don't have a lot else to share, so I'm going to share myself with you. That my own consciousness and knowledge was sparked by my own history and background as a student of urban sociology, as well as my love of cities. I grew up in a suburb of St. Louis, but learned early on that cities were different than suburbs, because I was fortunate to have a mother that would take me to downtown St. Louis all the time, to old bookstores and areas of the city that people in the white suburb I grew up in never ever ventured into. Nobody went to downtown St. Louis when I was growing up. I grew up in a western suburb. And I learned that if I had a choice, I clearly wanted to live in a city. And that's in fact why I chose to go to college in Chicago, because that city literally took my breath away every time I drove through it during my family holidays, because my grandparents lived in Milwaukee and I lived in St. Louis, and we drove our station wagon from St. Louis to Milwaukee, and you would just come up on the city on Lakeshore Drive, And I still get chills when I think about the built environment and the skyscrapers and the landscape of a city like Chicago. And of course, we went into the city too. And then I went to college in Chicago, and at that moment, I knew I never wanted to live anywhere but a diverse, thriving city with a lot of difference. Later, when I studied urban sociology at Northwestern, I learned about theories of cosmopolitanism, among other sociological frameworks, to understand the urban experience, and other theories that underscored the power, connection, and even social satisfaction that comes from living within diversity and through connectivity. Of course, I read some of the other authors who've been noted today. I mean, we really sit on the same page, Amber, about thinking sociologically and not just culturally about cities. But also, Chicago, the home of the Chicago School of Sociology and Urban Sociology, when I was studying, I learned to think about physical space in a very different way. And I realized that social relationships were both products and producers of physical spaces and vice versa, for both good and for bad. And I do remember one assignment in an urban sociology class where I rode my bike to a black neighborhood in Evanston, Illinois, in order to complete a paper about the community, a big concept in urban sociology. We've studied it from so many different dimensions. And in the process, discovered how spatially isolated the neighborhood was. I had no idea before I got on my bike. Cut off by train tracks, no grid, difficult to traverse, environmentally unstable conditions everywhere. So in short, at that moment, it was clear to me that the spatial context of social life was something that I'd never really thought about, because I had, I guess to quote what Michael was saying, that I had thought about spaces through the white spatial imaginary all the time. Those were the spaces I knew, and I didn't know how to see or read or experience other spaces. And thinking about the social and spatial imaginary has become a part of my own work. As some of you might know, I don't work on American cities. I'm a specialist of urbanism and urbanization in the global South, particularly Latin America. But the same set of analytics continue to mark my thinking. In Latin American cities, the history of spatial exclusion is as powerful as and related to social exclusion as it is here, if not more. It also, well, I'm going to come back on that, not more. It also is directly related to planning practice. Because planning practices, particularly modernist planning practices, have reinforced social spatial exclusion in ways that fuels a multiplicity of problems for the cities that I study. And for the cities as a whole, and not just the people who live in those excluded neighborhoods. So I've made some arguments, some of you have heard about the ways that modernist planning is connected to social spatial exclusion, which in turn is connected directly to violence. Now, to be sure, in Latin American cities, the most excluded are defined by class and ethnicity, and slightly less so race, depending on which country you're in. Brazil is different than Mexico. I work mostly in Mexico. But the same principles of thinking about the ways that spatial conditions enable or constrain justice and inclusion are just as relevant in American cities as they are in cities I study in the rest of the world. And so I'll just have a little promo or side comment here that now in full circle, Michael was mentioning earlier, I'm coming back with the same lens that I've been using to look at Latin American cities and violence, and looking at St. Louis, Missouri, where I grew up. That started me on this journey, and so many people in this room are going to be helping with that conference that we're having here March 30th and 31st, and we're going to be thinking about the way that the history of violence going back to the Civil War, so violence on the national scale, violence on the local scale are all interconnected in the production of space that reproduces more fragmentation, exclusion, and violence. And I'm extremely excited about that project, and I think I'm coasting on the energy that the Black in Design organizers have already started here at the GSD to move forward to spring. I think it's going to be an amazing year for us here at the GSD. So to close, let me just say that I want to loop back in terms of pedagogy to the sensibility that urban sociology cultivated in me as being absolutely critical, informing and reinforcing my views, as well as my definition of the pedagogic aims of a design school like ours. I know it's not common for design schools to showcase sociological thinking or have faculty with a background in sociology, but I firmly believe that all students here should be exposed to the classical theories and methods of urban sociology, and that a sociological imagination and consciousness should be more emphasized and better articulated in our curriculum. You have it already in your classes, Amber, and we have to do a better job here, not just in planning design, but landscape as well as in the architecture program. For me, a sociological imagination forces us to think about the experiential connection between people and the built environment, as well as people and the urban experience more generally. And this is the very first step in thinking about how people can live together under what conditions, and with what ethical or justice needs met or ignored. And I'm hoping to be able to advance these pedagogic aims more conscientiously here at the GSD in the months and years ahead. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Fantastic. Great. Good afternoon, everybody. So I would also like to thank the organizers. You've done an incredible job. You know, I was contacted, I believe, very early on in the organization, and I was just observing with great awe, you know, the way you were doing everything, the way you were handling everything, and, you know, really tirelessly keeping people on track for these 1.5 days that we are into now and that we still have ahead. So I would like to say that I'm also greatly humbled and following Diane here to be part of this conference. I consider myself incredibly lucky, of course, also, but really very humbled, especially because my formal training was not in African American studies or American history in general, for that matter. I should probably also mention in this context that I'm not American. And even, you know, my country that I'm from, so Germany, has its own challenges at the moment, which are probably actually not that dissimilar in many respects. But regardless, I am a landscape historian interested in the politics of design and space, and also identity politics, besides many other things. And so it is in this capacity that I will present to you some of my concerns with regards to the pedagogy of the field. And I should also mention at this point that I'm going to talk a little bit more about content, which might be, you know, familiar to some of you, but I consider as a historian, as a scholar, not sufficiently studied yet, and I will come back to that point a little further along in my presentation. So landscape architecture is a relatively young field. The first professional organizations were founded in the late 19th century. It's also a field that is very fuzzy, but it's in all its fuzziness. It is social, it is political, and it is cultural, amongst many other things. So as a result of all this, its historiography is young as well, even if the first historiographic accounts, often part mythical and part factual, go back to the 18th century. And I consider landscape history at the moment to stand at a crossroads where we have to look backwards but also forwards, learning from earlier historiography that within its limitations, of course, was on occasion surprisingly inclusive. For example, by way of integrating material history and the history of labor and technology. And what I'm showing you here is actually a page from John Claudius Lauden's treatise or encyclopedia of gardening from the early 19th century. And you see that material and labor, even looking back into history, is actually dealt with already in the 19th century. But especially, of course, what becomes important in my field is also taking to heart the new perspectives and openings that critical theory has offered us in the last half century or so. In short, I would say landscape history needs to become more inclusive and pluralist. It needs additions, more research, new critical scholarship, and new perspectives. But it also needs revisions. Revisions to include not only, for example, the histories of women in the profession, but also the lives of African American women and men who shaped, designed, built, and used designed landscapes, and for whom designed landscapes could mean segregation and discrimination, but also empowerment and emancipation, as we heard before as well. In particular, I believe we need inclusive and integrated histories that focus on the relationships between people of different ethnicities and races, and the relationships between them and the landscapes they created and inhabited. And I believe that it certainly makes sense to teach courses that look at landscape history through the lens of African American studies or Black studies. And we've heard some beautiful about some beautiful examples that may or may not, however, be focused maybe more around the actual built artifact and constructed buildings rather than the open space. But what happens in the big survey classes is really a question that I want to address here. So it is here where we really need to provide an overview, and this overview has to include matters of race. As it stands at the moment, though, what can be and is included is based upon extensive and often primary research by the respective lecturer, as only few landscape histories have addressed race more explicitly. I should mention some of them at least here. There are others, of course, also, but Diane Harris, a landscape historian, cultural geographer Richard Chine, and environmental designer Richard Westmacott are some of the authors who have dealt with the subject matter and have started to lead the way. By focusing on or including race, it becomes clear that aspects of labor, social, and political history need to move to the foreground. Many dominant narratives can be revised and diversified in this process. So, for example, while formal histories of antebellum gardens in the Deep South would focus on the elaborate boxwood knot gardens modeled on patterns and similar practices in European gardens of the 16th and 17th centuries, looking at the larger context of the plantation home, of course, shows how the power relationships between the planter and his slaves are revealed in the spatial distribution of slave quarters, and how the slave quarters and their labor are hidden and camouflaged by vegetation. So the slave quarters here in the back, and then the kind of almost literal hiding, of course, also of these same constructions. So spatial segregation affecting African Americans and the use made of landscape design and vegetation for this purpose becomes even more unobtrusive in another period and context. Parks were used in early 20th century southern cities like Atlanta to segregate, but also to conceal racial segregation. Parks were built as spatial barriers between white and black neighborhoods to prevent African Americans from entering the white neighborhoods. Following Jim Crow laws, there were parks and park systems for the white and black parts of the population, like Frederick Douglass Park in Louisville, Kentucky, that you see here. And summer camps divided by race and gender, as you can see in this case, of the Colored Girls Patriotic League of Louisville. When the Olmsted brothers were hired to draw up a park system plan for Birmingham, Alabama, they noted that 40% of the population were African American, and that while they had not made any specific recommendations for what they called Negro parks, you see the marked area here, provisions for the recreation of African Americans certainly should be made. But yet, they were only limited to one paragraph. If the same facilities were used, for example, in this 1920s golf course in Washington's East Potomac Park, they were open to African American citizens only one afternoon per week. In the late 19th and well into the 20th century then, the use of urban public open space was largely divided by race. And in contrast to what some commentators argued in the 1920s, parks and public open space in the South and the North, East and West were also a battleground between the races. So obviously this is a gross overstatement that the author is making here when he published this photograph in 1920. So as scholars like Galen Krantz and Robin Bacon have pointed out, racial conflicts and tensions were not only caused by metropolitan park politics, but they were also often played out in the parks themselves. In Chicago at the beginning of the 20th century, for example, white gangs terrorized African Americans who tried to use the baseball fields in Washington Park. In the sprawling metropolis of Los Angeles, racial tensions led to the segregation of many recreation grounds, including swimming pools, beaches, and parks, until into the second half of the 20th century. In the national capital in the 1960s, Meridian Hill Park, an icon of neoclassical public urban park design in the United States that was planned as the northern portal to the city amongst embassies and big mansions, finally became the location of African American rallies against urban renewal projects in the nearby African American neighborhood of Shaw. Thus, landscape and its various forms has been contested ground, exclusionary space, but also space for protest and empowerment. So I would like to end this short presentation with a small vignette for my current book project. And for this purpose, I'm going to describe to you briefly the content of a children's story entitled, "What Are We Going to Do, Michael?" It was written in the 1970s by Nellie Borchardt. So in this story, 10-year-old Michael, whom you see here sitting on the stoop, together with his adult friend, Mrs. Jacobson, helps to save an 80-year-old southern magnolia tree that is threatened to be cut down to make way for an urban renewal project in the neighborhood. Nellie Borchardt's story is based upon true facts and events occurring in Brooklyn's Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood in the 1960s and early 1970s. Yet the way in which Borchardt portrays her fictional young hero, Michael, and his friend, Mrs. Jacobson, belie parts of the true story. As you can see in the children's book, the two protagonists appear as white residents. They are also portrayed as residents of a rundown, racially diverse neighborhood. In reality, however, Mrs. Jacobson was Hattie Cawthon, an African-American woman in her 70s living on a deteriorating neighborhood block in Bedford-Stuyvesant. By 1970, Bedford-Stuyvesant had become the second largest African-American community in the United States, and as Harold Connolly wrote in 1977, a code word for America's unresolved urban and race problems. Regardless of whether Borchardt's choice to change the race of her protagonists had anything to do with the book's aspired sales numbers or readership, or with the more idealist educational and egalitarian aspirations to cultivate white children's empathy and awareness of nature in the city and of its ethnically and racially diverse citizenry, or in turn even with an unabashed racism, both the choice of the story itself as well as the changes made to its principal characters reflected the social concerns and anxieties of the time. But changing the race of the principal characters, while perhaps making the story more accessible to the anticipated majority of readers, also covered up one of the most important facts about it. By rallying for the protection of the southern magnolia, successfully saving it and the 3 historic brownstone buildings behind it, and by founding and running the neighborhood tree corps for the planting and maintenance of neighborhood street trees, African American citizens of Bedford-Stuyvesant turned trees into a means of empowerment and emancipation within the civil rights movement. While the planting, maintenance, and conservation of trees became a grassroots initiative of Bedford-Stuyvesant's African-American citizens to assert their rights to the city and to its spaces in general, the tree planting and conservation activities provided in particular the most vulnerable and powerless groups, women and children, with a way to make themselves heard and seen. Tree planting and plant-ins became their tool of community building as well as a civil right that could be used against ghettoization. So in the context of today's event, I do not have time to go into the further details of the story. They're also not important for the point that I want to make here. Although historiography can obviously not be compared to a children's story, I hope this small vignette about the story can help to show how important it is to write and tell inclusive histories. In contrast to Nelly Borchards' artistic freedom and the pedagogical intents she may have had with her book, in the pedagogy of landscape history, we need to provide students with awareness and with the tools to ask critical questions so that histories can be written that do not misrepresent the facts, but that are firmly grounded in factual knowledge and then offer appropriate analysis and interpretation and the opportunity for merging theory and history. So more inclusive histories can lead to new perspectives and ultimately also to uncovering new ground that we did not even know existed before. Thank you.